Hi, I'm Helen Goult. I'm an educational psychologist, and we're going to look at a presentation considering the best use of teaching assistants, and this is the e-learning bite-sized module. So the aims of the session, we are going to become familiar with the research around the use of teaching assistants, the interpretation of the current research, to identify areas of practice that have the potential for positive transformation, and to consider the recommendations to improve practice. So the evidence base that we're considering today, the Deployment and Impact of Support Staff Project, DISH et al., Bradford et al. In 2009, is the largest study of teaching assistants and other school support staff carried out in the world. It was named by the British Educational Research Association as one of the 40 landmark studies to have had a significant impact on education in the last 40 years. It's the first longitudinal study to analyse the impact of TAs on teachers, teaching and pupils' learning, behaviour and academic progress in everyday classroom settings. The findings have been widely reported in the media and have important implications for teaching, school management and the education of pupils, especially those with special educational needs. Now, the effective deployment of teaching assistants project was then launched to address the practical issues raised by the DISH project. And the Action Research Project was conducted over the 2010-2011 school year. And then finally, we're going to consider making the best use of teaching assistants resource from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF. And they produced a book and a website that has a wealth of resources that we can use. So thinking about TAs, thinking about the background context. Now, the proportion of teachers has remained relatively stable over the years. But the proportion of full-time equivalent TAs has more than trebled since 2000. So now more than half the staff in mainstream schools in England is comprised of people other than teachers. So 28% TAs, 48% teachers at the moment. Real-term cuts to school funding since 2015 have led to a big reduction in the number of TAs in school. The school workforce census in 2016, there may have been a slightly more recent one, but at that point there was 387,900 TAs working in schools in England. And the annual government spending of approximately 4.4 billion per year on TAs, that's 13% of the education budget. So, thinking about the research that's gone into TAs, and before the DISH project, there tended to have been sort of looking at three areas of study. Studies measuring the impact of curriculum interventions and catch-up programs delivered by TAs. Studies focusing on the impact from other forms of TA deployment. And those studies focusing on the impact of TAs on pupils' academic attainment. So we're going to consider some of the earlier research and then think about what that means in terms of the research that's come from the DISH project. So thinking about the historical studies that looked at the effects of curriculum interventions and catch-up programs delivered by TAs. A lot of this research has been done internationally on a smaller scale and involving smaller samples, sort of 300 to 200 pupils. Using the randomised control trial, so that would indicate that one set of pupils received the intervention and one set of pupils would have received maybe the action or intervention that they would have normally been doing. Now, there is a growing evidence base that supports the use of TAs using involved in catch-up and intervention programs. And the Educational Endowment Foundation talks about that, and we'll look at that when we're thinking about our recommendations. So there's good evidence that pupils make good progress in literacy and numeracy as a result of a structured curriculum intervention delivered by TAs. But there's a caveat there that is only when the TAs have been properly trained to deliver these programs. Often this research has been used as conclusive proof of TA impact, and the DISH project sort of wanted to look at TAs more widely used in the classroom and thinking about attainment. So Further studies thinking about the impact of other forms of TA deployment. So there's a lot of good evidence coming out to show that they are effective in running curriculum-based interventions and structured interventions with the correct training. But the research has also shown that delivering intervention takes up on average of 40 minutes of a TA's day. So further evidence thinking about how else they are deployed. So there's good evidence that delegating the routines and routine administration tasks to TAs can free teachers up to focus more time on core functions. Now, benefits are also found in terms of reducing workload and improving teachers' perceptions of stress and job satisfaction. So teachers are feeling well supported by their TAs. Teachers are largely positive about the contributions of TAs in classrooms, reporting that increased attention and support for learning for those pupils who struggle most has a direct impact on their learning and an indirect impact and effect on the learning of the rest of the class. So results from observations made as part of the DIS project confirmed teachers' views that TAs had a positive effect in terms of reducing disruption and allowing more time for teachers to teach. So now we'll consider some of the historical studies focusing on the impact of TAs on pupils' academic performance. So there's only a few studies that have systematically measured the direct impact of TA support on pupil attainment under normal classroom conditions. So the Tennessee Student Achievement Report, STAR, found no beneficial effects on pupil attainment having a teacher aide in kindergarten to grade 3 classes. So that's the equivalent of our years 1 to 4. Longitudinal research from the UK Class Size and Pupil Adult Ratios project found similar results. Pupils with SEN assigned to TAs for support have been shown to make less progress than their unsupported peers, both in literacy and in maths. So, thinking about the deployment and impact of support staff, DIS project, on top of those historical sort of studies or earlier studies, the effect of those, the TA support on pupils' attainment is at variance with the positive views about the teachers about their impact. Now, the DIS study was completed between 2003 and 2008. There's no exact comparison available. Experience and evidence gained during the more recent effective deployment of teaching assistants and making a statement there, the maths studies conducted between 2010 and 2013 suggested that the use of TAs has not changed substantially since then, and currently collating more data on more recent observations. Now, this project was designed to fill the gaps in knowledge about TA's deployment and impact, and it focused on all types of support staff and all pupils. It was the largest study undertaken on support staff. There was a large-scale questionnaire with 18,000 responses from school leaders, support staff and teachers, and the detailed analysis of the effect of TA support on the academic progress of 8,200 pupils. And that involved detailed systematic observation. So it really was a very large longitudinal study. And thinking about the impact on pupil academic attainment, 16 of the 21 results were in a negative direction. So there was no positive effects of TA support for any subject for any year group. And pupils receiving the most TA support made less progress than similar pupils who received little or no TA support. And this is even for controlling for factors likely to be related to academic progress and the allocation of TA support, such as prior attainment and SEN status. There was also evidence that the negative impact was most marked for pupils with the highest level of SEN, so those who typically receive the most TA support. Now, the DIS project also examined the effect of TA support on 8 scales considering positive approaches for learning, so those that aren't necessarily considering the academic progress. And that considered factors such as distractibility, task, confidence, motivation, disruptiveness, independence, relationships with other pupils, completion of assigned work, and following instructions from adults. The results showed little evidence that the amount of support pupils received from TAs over a school year improved these dimensions, except for those in year 9, 13 to 14-year-olds, where there was a clear positive effect of TA support across all 8 of the PAL outcomes. So the evidence on the impact of TAs on non-academic outcomes is thin, and it's largely based on impressionistic data of how we perceive that support to be the impact of that support. So in summary, the TAs are having a good impact on delivering interventions, with the caveat that those TAs have had sufficient training on that particular intervention. And their impact having a positive impact on reducing workload and therefore job satisfaction and stress within teachers. But negative or no impact on academic performance. And the negative impact is most marked for pupils with SEN. We might reasonably assume that these pupils who were given the most TA support in the first place would have been those most likely to make less progress in any case. However, such explanations in terms of pre-existing characteristics of pupils are unlikely in this study because the factors that typically affect progress and the allocation of SEN support, such as SEN status, prior attainment, the measure of deprivation, were all controlled for in the statistical analysis. So could a possible explanation for the negative relationship between TA support and pupil progress be due to the different levels of TA qualifications relative to teachers? But the research has not found that teachers or TA levels of qualifications are related to their effectiveness. So in terms of thinking about accounting for this negative relationship between TA involvement and pupil progress, Sharps et al. Considered this and concluded it's the decisions made about TAs, their employment and deployment, not decisions made by TAs, that best explain the effects of TA support in the classroom on pupil progress. So in other words, it's thinking don't blame the TAs. It's how it's set up, how they're deployed, how they're prepared, how it's structured. So with that in mind, this wider pedagogical report, this model, considered some of the areas that they considered were important in terms of preparing TAs and the characteristics that they required. So the 3 next main explanations for these sort of troubling and unexpected findings on the impact of TA support on pupil learning. It's thinking about preparedness, deployment, and practice. Other things they thought about were the characteristics of support staff, such as their age, gender, ethnicity, qualifications and experience, and also the conditions of their employment, the goodwill of TAs and other support staff, and line and performance management processes in each individual setting. So preparedness, deployment and practice is what we're going to consider over the next few slides. So thinking about the deployment of TAs, how the TAs are used across the school and the decision making behind this, the DIS project found that the TAs have a direct pedagogical role, supporting and interacting with pupils, and this exceeds the time spent supporting the teacher and curriculum or performing other tasks. So teachers tended to interact with pupils in whole class context and infrequently worked with them on an individual and group basis. It's TAs who spend more time working with groups, individuals, sort of i.e. those contexts that generally allow higher quality interaction between adult and pupil. The majority of TAs spent the majority of their time working with lower attaining pupils and pupils identified as having SEN. Pupils were 9 times more likely to have sustained interactions with TAs than teachers, and they were 6 times more likely to be actively involved in their interactions with the TAs than with the teachers. So for the majority of the interactions with teachers, pupils were just one of a crowd. So the unintended consequence of the deployment of TAs has resulted in this separation effect. So as a result of a high amount of TA support, often constant, pupils with the highest level of SEN spend less time in their classrooms, less time with the teacher, and have fewer opportunities for peer interaction compared with non-SEN pupils. And it outlined pupils with statements, so pupils with education, health and care plans, compared to average attaining non-SEN pupils, spent the equivalent of over a day a week away from their classroom, spent less time in whole class teaching with teachers, were 3 times more likely to interact with TAs than teachers, and they had about half as many opportunities to interact with peers as the average attaining pupils, and that's come from the slightly more recent maths study from the on the back of the DIS project. So the TAs in mainstream schools regularly adopt the status of primary educator for pupils most in need. And the impact of TA support on their academic progress is much worse compared to non-supported pupils. So it's becoming that the TA support is an alternative to teacher input, not, as it's often suggested, additional to it. So that's one of those unintended consequences around how TAs are deployed. So the second area we're thinking about in terms of how TAs work is thinking about the project findings on practice. Thinking about that pupils' one-to-one interactions with TAs are likely to be sort of more interactive compared with their interactions with teachers. But they've also found that these interactions differ in their quality. And there was 4 overarching characteristics of TAs how TAs talk to pupils were found. TAs talk was frequently more concerned with task completion than with ensuring any learning and understanding has taken place. The TA interactions with pupils could be broadly characterised as reactive because, unlike teachers who guided lessons with planned learning aims in mind, the TAs had to routinely respond to the needs of the pupils and the lessons in the moment. TAs did more prompting, and when they did, it could sometimes tip over into spoon feeding, where TAs take up too much responsibility for doing the task for the pupil. And the TAs tended to close down talk, both linguistically and cognitively, whereas teachers generally open up pupil talk. So that's thinking about closed questions versus open questions. Thinking lightly as the TAs had an action to complete, a job to do, and were more focused on that task completion area. So the unintended consequence of this practice can limit the understanding, weaken pupils' sense of control over their learning, and reduce their capacity to develop independent learning skills. So TAs might not know how to make the best use of the extended, more frequent interactions they have with pupils. And that leads us on to the third section, thinking how effectively are they prepared for the roles that they undertake. So this concept of preparedness, the training and professional development that TAs and teachers receive, including how teachers manage and organise the work of TAs. And secondly, the day-to-day preparation. So the data was showing that 75% of teachers reported having no training in how to manage and organise the work of TAs. However, over half of the Senkos line managed 1 or more TAs, yet 2 out of 3 hadn't received any training for this role. So no specific entry requirements for TAs, and many TAs don't receive induction training. So further thinking about the concept of the preparation and the training that TAs are receiving, in terms of the day-to-day, 75% of teachers reported that they don't have any allocated planning or feedback time with the TAs they worked with, and that's 95% in secondary schools. So communication between teachers and TAs was largely ad hoc, So the unintended consequence of this is that the TAs are underprepared for some of the tasks that they are given. They may go into lessons blind and have to tune in to the teacher's delivery and to pick up the vital subject and knowledge, the tasks and instructions. So we're thinking about the recommendations and thinking about what can we do in schools to best support our TAs and best make the best use of their time and their involvement in supporting our young people. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation has made a recommendations summary with detailed recommendations, and here's the summary, considering 7 different areas in terms of next steps. Now, these recommendations are further explored within the larger training module that's available, but we'll just look at the headlines here and think about each of the 7 recommendations. So first of all, TA should not be used as an informal teaching resource for low attaining pupils. So although this has happened with the best of intentions, it's not conducive to the best outcomes for these children. So the second recommendation, thinking about everyday classroom conditions, is using the TAs to add value to what teachers do rather than replacing them. So then that's using the TAs to help pupils to develop independent learning skills and manage their own learning, and ensure that the TAs are fully prepared for their role in the classroom. So the TAs also have the information, the learning plans, time to speak to the teachers in advance. So thinking about the effective use of TAs in delivering structured interventions out of the class. So these are the next 2 recommendations. And this is where the evidence was showing a good response of TA-led interventions, having the correct training being important. So using the TAs to deliver high quality one-to-one and small group support using structured interventions and adopting evidence-based interventions to support TAs in their small group and one-to-one instructions. So it's important that these interventions are evidence-based, that they are consistently delivered, regularly delivered. So you'd be looking between 20 to 50 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week over an extended period, so of 8 to 20 weeks even, to make sure that there's the consistent evidence-based interventions delivered, and making sure that staff delivering those interventions have sufficient training on those interventions. And the recommendations here suggest between 5 and 30 hours of training on each particular intervention to make sure those TAs are really adept and able to develop those, deliver those interventions, having the most positive outcomes as a result. And then thinking about integrating the learning from work led by teachers and TAs. So making sure that the explicit connections are made between learning from everyday classroom teaching and structured interventions. So making sure that the young person understands what they've been learning in their time in structured intervention, that they can learn back into the classroom. So making sure those links are explicit, because the young people might not always make those links between what the pre-teaching of particular vocabulary and things like that. Look, we practice these spellings. Oh, look, we've learnt these words. So just thinking then the 10 reasons to improve the use of teaching assistants. So carrying on with the status quo, really given the data, it's not an option. The evidence is there that as things are at the minute, it's having a more negative impact attainment. So effective TA deployment can have such a positive impact. So the resources are already there. Within schools in England, we've got over 380,000 TAs, with the average school spending over £200,000 per year on TAs. Schools that overcome practical barriers to change do so by investing time, attention and effort into making these improvements, not by spending lots of money. Upskilling a TA raises their professional profile and status and makes them feel more valued. And the research shows that teachers benefit. The effective use of TAs can reduce workload and stress and improve classroom behaviour. So dynamic coordinated partnerships, responding to real-time needs, improving the use of your current TA workforce, using pupil pre-move funds to do that rather than employing more TAs. So skilling up your current TA workforce with suitable training and resources. Information about evidence-based interventions, practical guidance and resources are available online to help. On the EEF website, there is lots of links to evidence-based interventions. Making best use of TAs is consistent with the school's obligations under the SEND Code of Practice, and it's considered and contributed to Ofsted grading inspection reports, and it's increasingly recognising the added value of effective TA deployment. Further to signposting the results on the EEF website, there's resources there that you could consider looking at to think about how to further develop this area. Some signposts here, such as a teacher-TA agreement, a scaffolding framework, interventions health check to consider whether the interventions in place are the most appropriate for those particular children, and a list of evidence-based literacy and numeracy interventions, making sure what you are putting in place has got the evidence base. A suggestion for school improvement cycle to address the use of TAs. A vision and exercise to help school think about what should be different, an assessment guide to assess current practice, things such as a TA observation schedule, an action planning tool, and guidance on creating policy. So, acting on the evidence. So, in order to bring about the necessary change, it's important that leadership comes from the head teacher, it said there, or senior management teams, looking at that cyclical review cycle, thinking about defining the role, purpose and contribution of TAs, developing whole school practice, providing training and preparation, and then review. And that can be a really effective change cycle when led by head teachers and senior leadership with regards to TA deployment. Finally, there's some useful websites linked to what we spoke about today. Thank you for spending the time listening to this presentation today. Further information can be found in the interactive course that's also available. Thank you.